And now I want to tell everyone that if you are going to be so shocked to see something that is not entirely connected to olfaction, well, please don't. I respect this audience very much. I think you're all very smart people to have come here. And I think that changing gears every now and then and exposing you to ideas that were not exactly in the theme is fine. And in fact, our responsibility as our conference organizers to give you a palate cleanser. I could not think of a more compelling and beautiful and artistic presentation and optimistic presentation than what Chris is about to give you, which has a connection to olfaction, but it is a story that started as a NASA project that he was involved in. I was doing something for NASA also with Algie. We met at a NASA conference, and I dropped my project and joined forces with Chris Maurer to create this project, which we call MycoHab, which was originally inspired by his work in creating habitat for Mars. At the end of his presentation, we'll hear from Irina, who is going to take this technology and bring it down to Austin, Texas. Chris, myself, and Carolyn, who will also join us, I hope. Please pipe her in if she's a presenter also. She should be joining, but we don't know how her connectivity is because she will be joining us from South Africa. Carolyn co-founded MycoHab with us, and we have an experimental outpost in Namibia growing mushrooms on agricultural waste and at the same time creating biocomposite materials that outperform concrete. This is in a country that has no bricks, has no construction industry. They have to import everything. They have a construction industry, but they have to import all the construction materials, or most of them. And of course, the construction industry is the worst polluter on the planet. Chris here is a visionary with a solution for pollution that spans the solar system, not just Earth. So with this, Chris, it's a pleasure to have you. Please give us your wonderful talk that I love so much this talk. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. And thanks for the invite. And I did my best this afternoon to try and make this about olfaction, actually. So there is a little bit in here about smells. And this will be maybe one of the only talks where I invite you to come with comments rather than questions, as you all are the experts on what I'm going to kind of conclude with, and I'd like to get your input, and we possibly see how this might become a real presentation to Osmocosm next year when we talk about the scientific research behind some of the olfaction characteristics of the materials that I'm going to present today. So I'm going to talk about space architecture. As Andreas mentioned, this is a project for NASA. We're involved in the NIAC program, NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts. And what our proposal is actually to grow buildings off planet. So we're using what we call biomaterials, or materials that use the growth of organisms in their manufacture to create building materials. And we can do that rather quickly with microorganisms because of the speed of the growth. And the first question.
I'm Chris Maurer from Red House Studio.
Oh shoot!
Cleveland, Ohio.
Can I
focus on research?
Oh. There you go.
Didn't know that had some audio to it. So hopefully you can't hear that anymore. I turned my audio down. But the main ideas we're trying to describe why bio is because we can reduce mass transport. We can do testable solutions here on planet Earth before we send it to off-planet destinations. And there are superior multifunctional materials. So these materials can be insulative, structural, they're ductile, they're bioperformative. And those bioperformative aspects can include things like radiation shielding and self-repairing aspects. Those are things that I will usually talk about in my presentation of this project, but today I'm going to shift to smells. The first part I talked about was the cost of transport materials. So it cost about $1 million to send 1 pound to Mars, or 100,000 to send 1 pound to the moon. That's 1 pound is a can of Coke, basically. And these figures vary, but we actually have been talking to some folks about sending a payload to the moon in 2025, and it was actually $1 million for 1 kilogram. So that's probably closer to $400,000 to get a pound to the moon. So very, very expensive to transport material off planet. So you obviously don't want to send bricks or concrete or timber to build your homes at these destinations. There are a couple solutions that you can do as a spacefaring company like NASA. You can either be like the turtle and you can take your home with you, so you can have a ready-built steel shell basically, and take that to destination and live out of that. That's how Apollo missions were done. They lived in the landers. Or you can be like the bird and you can have faith in your own ability to build your habitat when you get to destination. So, these are kind of the correlations there, the human, the Habitat Development Unit, or the ISRU, in situ resource utilization techniques, where you can basically build with what's on the planet or moon already, which is pretty much just regolith, which is the lunar or Martian soil. So you can kind of, imagine 3D printing with that. You have to melt it, you have to create lava, you have to create building materials out of that. And then what you get at the end of the day is not really a great material, because rock is not a great insulator. It's not great at radiation protection. It's not great at a lot of things. It's not ductile at all. So not a great material to build with. Our proposal is somewhere in the middle here. And if you look on the left, you'll see the mass of transit. So basically we have this pre-packaged inflatable that starts off as about 10 tons. That's not obviously very light, but when it expands to a bigger footprint by adding gases and water and other nutrients sourced from the planet, you can add a lot of that tonnage that creates biomass within the building. Firstly, by adding water to these growing cells that produce algae. The algae are autotrophic, so they can produce biomass, and then the biomass that's grown is used to become fodder for mycelium. The mycelium binding those things together, creating a composite material. This is kind of a section through the building that kind of shows how that works. So each one of these cells is basically a bioreactor that grows the biomass and then becomes the living habitat for the mycelium to create that composite material. We're using drop stitch material, which is basically inflatable material that have stitching between the top and bottom layers in the air cavity, and that can enable us to do complex shapes. And it also acts as reinforcing for the biomaterial that grows inside of it. So this is an example of an autotroph we might grow, and these are grown in bioreactors very easily, just using, kind of a fish tank type scenario where you're filtering the nitrogen from fish using this chaetomorpha. And you can see there the resources needed are all in the parts per thousands, parts per million. So to even deliver all of the nutrients to grow a lot of biomass, you could deliver that from Earth with very little weight when it gets to destination. The things that are heavy are going to be the water and the gases, which can all be sourced on Mars. So, here's an example of how you can have several bioreactors, several habitats, all kind of linked in series to create settlements. And a section through a different design, basically, that looks at ways that the bioreactor, the algal bioreactor, could become part of the building even after the building is built, allowing that to be part of the life support system, where it can actually scrub carbon dioxide. It can process human waste and recycle that into useful things like biomass. Here's a short animation of some of the inflatables that we've built to date. We're currently actually growing mycelium inside and on top of a lot of these forms, and there'll be more on that in the near future. Here are two images of feedstocks that we're looking at. So I mentioned the autotrophic organisms. These are usually algae that we're growing mycelium on. And on the right there, you see basically, it's basically sand, but it's a stand-in for regolith simulant, the type of soil that you would find on the moon or on Mars. The mycelium is able to grow through that and bind it together. It doesn't use it as a food stock the same way that the living organisms are, or the bio-based organisms are. So you do have to add extra nutrients for that mycelium to grow. But basically what that serves as is an aggregate in the same way that gravel or sand are aggregates in concrete. So it takes up mass. And some of the material, so I mentioned some of the metrics that we're talking about. These are insulative and strong materials. There you see a fairly unscientific demonstration of the impact resistance of it. But we have done physical characterization in testing from MIT to Stanford and even in Namibia where this block was produced. And I think the folks later will talk more about our project in Namibia. But basically, we can get compression strength that are about twice that of concrete block. We can get bending strengths much higher, and the insulation value being high is, also a fantastic resource. When it comes to comparing this to different ISRU, again, in situ resource utilization materials, the only one where it's not, first out of all is the compression strength. And when we're building the types of structures that we're building off planet, the compression strength doesn't matter nearly as much as it does on Earth, because on Earth we're mostly concerned with gravity. We're concerned with the downward force of the pressures from live load, dead load, snow loads, all kinds of things building up on our roofs and our floors and pushing down. In low pressure atmospheric environments, most of the force is actually outwards because you have a pressurized vessel that is much higher pressure than the outside. So it's actually pushing outwards. So you need better moduluses of elasticity. You need better tensile strength and things like that. But most importantly, you need resistance to thermal transmission and resistance to radiation protection. And I have a whole talk on the bioperformative aspects of mycelium, melanin-rich mycelium, to actually perform radiosynthesis that can protect you from ionizing radiation. But again, we're going to look at olfaction this time. This video basically, it's a little bit magical the way this building gets set up. But what we wanted to show here is it's not only possible to create the structure of the building, but the interiors of the building as well. And pretty soon here, we'll jump into the inside of the building and you'll start to see the furniture, beds and cabinetry and seating being formed, even things like plumbing fixtures, like the sink and the toilet and the shower, they're being formed. These can all be done by, the same method where you have this sealed bag that then fills with the bio material from just adding water, basically adding water and nutrients and letting the things grow. And I wanted to conclude the space part of that basically with this slide. And this is one of the early renders that we did that talked about not only using these mycoterials to build things, but using compressed regolith inside the building that looks like rammed earth. All of the things except for the electronics in here, the fabrics, the leathers, the furniture, the doors, those kind of things can actually be manufactured out of mycoterials or various forms of bioterials. And this, to me, creates kind of a earthy sense of material. It's not that sterile ISS type of imagery that you see when normally we're looking at space dwellings. And so that's kind of what brings me to this census. So, obviously, all I can convey to you here is a visual image. But I wanted to kind of switch gears and start talking about the smells that come from these materials. And, it's been mentioned probably several times today that smell is the sense most closely linked to memory. Scientists believe it's because the old olfactory bulb is closely linked to the limbic system, which controls mood, memory, behavior, and emotion. There's a very famous book by an author named Juhani Palasma, who's a Finnish author that talks about architectural discourse, mostly phenomenology throughout architecture. And his book, The Eyes of the Skin, really talks about the different senses in architecture, ones that we don't pay as much attention to because of these things like where we're always talking in images. And he calls this ocular centrism, basically that's our default towards vision rather than the other senses. But he says ocular centrism has housed the intellect and the eye, but left the body and the other senses, as well as our memories, imagination, dreams, homeless. So this is basically, talking about this book here talks about the different senses, and he goes into a lot about the perception of smell and how that can affect architecture. He quotes often from Gaston Bachelard, who wrote The Poetics of Space and 1958, where he talks about different cabinets having the smell of raisins and how that transported them to different times. But a whiff of perfume or even the slightest odor can create an entire environment in the world of the imagination. So he talks a lot about how imagination can be tied to the sense of smell. This is where we kind of jump from sensation into perception. So those two need to really be distinguished, whereas sensation refers to the process of receiving information through the senses. Perception is the way your brain interprets these sensations. In other words, sensations is about receiving information, where perception is the processing of this information. And in Eyes of the Skin, Plasma talks a lot about Henri Bergson's conception of perception being tied to memory. Without a database for memory of space, we can hardly understand what we see, smell, and feel. Sorry. we would be in a constant state of sensory overload if we had to interpret all of the data that is entering our sensory perceptions. And I'm sure all the scientists know this better than anyone. The bombardment of photons that go through your optical sensors, the bombardment of smells that go into the olfactory receptors, that would just overwhelm anyone if they had to interpret that. And Andreas sees this when he's teaching, telling robots to do this, because they have so much to deal with. You have to kind of down select all of that information and understand what's important. So as we go through life and we develop these senses, we understand that we can make associations from different from different visualizations, that we know that, okay, that over there's a door, that's a window, I can see outside. But if we had to kind of piece that together every time we looked at that, it would be a hard time. So there is this spectrum of what he says of memory and perception, and those two things tying together are really what makes perception different from the perception different than your sensory input. It is this memory, is understanding, having this understanding from from experiencing things before. That memory plays part of that, and that's why your smells are also tied to this sense of memory, is because your memory has that perception involved with it. So how does this relate to mycoterials we're talking about? Obviously, mushrooms, they have a pleasant sense when you're cooking them. Mold has a very terrible sense. So when we're talking about fungal sense, there are certainly a wide spectrum of things that we need to look at, to consider. There are lots of scientific papers on the odorants based off of mushrooms, and how the food part of that really can affect our perception and our experience in life. And in this case, it's talking about the experience of saltiness being affected by the odorants. There are lots of studies on biophilic smells and how those can actually reduce stress and reduce anxiety, reduce blood pressure. But there's very little that I've found on mycoterial specifically, because I think that there's very few mycoterials. I happen to have one here, and we have several. Andreas, Carolyn, and I all have some, but probably no one else in this room does. So my thought on that is to talk to you all and see if anybody is interested in doing a study on mycoterials and what these odorants are, because interestingly enough, when I smell it, I get a different sense than Andreas, and everyone I've talked to gets a different sense. And I joke about this a little bit, that it's a little bit like this amortentia, this love potion that everyone kind of smells one of their favorite things when they smell this. I get like the smell of like waffles and syrup, and ask Andreas what he gets. But there's this scene in Harry Potter where Hermione is smelling this love potion, and she's remembering something that we're kind of alluded to, the fact that she's starting to get into Ron Weasley in this part of the story. So that's probably a stretch. It's probably not actually what's going on here, but there are different experiences from the deodorants that come from these materials. And what would be fun is if we could maybe talk to some of the folks in the room, convince them to become an Osmo cosmonaut, and look into what are these odorants, and how can we tie them back to a chart like this, and what are the possible cognitive performance issues that come from materials like this, and can we make the case to folks like NASA, to other organizations, that it's not just about mass transport, it's actually about psychological well-being, that we should be looking into these biomaterials. And so, yeah, that's where I'll end. And hopefully you can see my email address there. And
Yes.
if anyone would like to reach out, I'd love to hear from you all. But thanks.
Thank you, Chris. That was a pleasant surprise for me. You did really connect it to olfaction. I did not ask him to do this, but he did it anyway. And he challenged us Osmonauts, by the way. We do have that already. We're called Osmonauts. He challenged the Osmonauts to go and look into the mycelium products and the biocomposites smell profile. He said also that I experienced it differently than he does. And indeed, it's true. When I smell it, I get this syrupy, there's definitely some kind of syrupy sweetness to the mycelium products. It is definitely pleasant, it's subtle, you have to put your nose really up to it, so it's not overwhelming at all, it's subtle. And I could easily see myself living in a place that smells like this. Currently, all our homes smell of formaldehyde, from the treated lumber.